The question?
Yeah, so the question was what were the numbers of the Indian American community? Did they vote in larger numbers, and did they vote more for Trump? So I was using the numbers that we do have so far are of the AAPI community. We have a resident expert in the audience, though. Shekar's here, so he can give the numbers. But I think we were at 79% for Hillary among AAPI voters, which is higher, 72% for Obama in 2012, 79% for Hillary is an increase. And I believe we had a higher turnout of AAPI voters. I do not actually know the number of Indian Americans, but you may. So Shekar, do you want to answer that question?
Sure. So
the only publicly available data is from the Asian American Legal and Defense Fund and from the National Asian American Survey. And both of them are pretty close because they were done at slightly different times. But they show that Indian Americans, and they don't break out by religion and so on. So there's a whole set of questions about how did Hindus vote. I don't know, and I don't care actually. But Indian Americans as a group, 87 to 88% voted for Hillary Clinton. And that is a number that is approximating what African Americans did for Hillary as well.
And it was roughly the same in 2012, so for Obama. So I don't think there was a large drop-off amongst voters for Hillary versus Trump. And now, one could discuss the kind of messages Donald Trump's outreach was really focused on, whether it was focused on reaching out to Hindu Americans, or did it have a more negative message towards Muslim Americans? I mean, I think one could debate those issues, but it seems at the end of the day that Indian Americans voted overwhelmingly. And Asian Americans, I think there's a lot of evidence that there were more Asian Americans engaged in the election, more voting than had ever voted before.
Ashley,
Thanks in part to Shekar and others' efforts.
I mean, there's no prima facie reason to doubt what Neera or Shekar said, because if you look at Devesh's book on Indian Americans, I mean, the data shows that they are overwhelmingly Democratic. And I don't think this election would be an opportunity for them to desert their traditional affiliations. So if someone makes an argument to the contrary, I think the burden of proof would be on them rather than on what the presumption is. Because I think the demographic affiliation, political affiliations of Indian Americans have been overwhelmingly Democratic. That has been known for a long time. And so I would be surprised if there was any fundamental deviation from what Neera suggested.
Indian Americans and Asian Americans turned out in larger numbers this year. And to your point, which is going from being competent to being significant, when you look at elections, you obviously are more focused on the swing vote. There was a lot of talk about Indian Americans being the swing vote this election, and Asian Americans. And even though if we take your statements on face value, which is that they actually did vote for Indian Americans did actually vote for Hillary Clinton, and they voted Democratic, and we have a Republican president now. So what do you think is the future? How do we stay significant? Are we significant at this point, given that the will of the people, so to speak, has not been? So are we that swing vote, or that sort of, let's go over this vote?
Yeah, so I think this is a great question, and I think we should answer in a very strong affirmative. So the reality is that the Indian American vote isn't equally distributed across states. If you look at the states Hillary won, and with greater ease, in fact, than had been won before, states that have been really close became easier for Hillary. Those states include Nevada, Virginia, Those are critical states that we had large Indian American populations and larger Asian American populations. Colorado, other states, obviously very large populations in New Jersey, New York, and California. Those are all states Hillary won handily. And I think the broader message I would have is that successful communities that have engaged successfully have not won every election. Communities that have engaged successfully in American politics and engaged in higher and higher numbers continually engage. And as I mentioned earlier, once people vote, they tend to vote. And once someone has voted once, their likelihood of voting in elections to come, every presidential election to come, has gone up almost infinitely. So the question to me is not, winning an election or losing an election, is how much you can engage and then build for the future. And I think what we saw in this election was that the states that Asian Americans are in were incredibly important to the coalition that, again, not to be partisan, but a majority of the country voted for. So it was not successful in the Electoral College, and perhaps Indian Americans should distribute their vote more evenly across the country. But in the absence of that, I think you saw very high impact in this election. And I think the test of this, though, is not just to engage in the election, but to have people engage with those communities before elections, way before elections, right after elections, and also for that community to do what other communities do, which is also engage in the legislative, not just the electoral battles to come. I have heard many Indian Americans argue that there's not enough issues on the Hill that matter to them. Well, that will not be a problem this election cycle, this legislative cycle, because we are going to have debates on the most far-reaching issues, defining not what bills should pass or who is helped, but really, in a way, defining who this country represents, who America is, and who Americans are. And I think Indian Americans, like every other group, but as much as any other group, have a stake in that debate. And so I hope those engaged by this election in the electoral process will become as connected to the political and legislative process as well.
Edward, can you follow up on that? I want to hear your thoughts about the significance. I mean, this is sort of the focus of this conference now.
Right. So I think the other thing that's happened, just to add to it, is in a lot of states, there are so many people who have run for school board,
Yes,
city
great point.
council,
Members of Congress was very
Congress,
important.
and other things too. So I think it's more than just the national level. I think people have been engaged even at the city council level and the state level. I think that's the other untold story in this, is the engagement at those levels. And I think that's equally important, not just be at the presidential level. So I think that's definitely one thing. But we are focused in 8 or 10 states. I mean, our population is. So I think, it's hard to reach outside that. But I think these are big and important states like California, New York, New Jersey, and others. Ashley, I know you wanted to add something too.
But I want to address this as a political scientist rather than as
Oh,
someone who's involved in the political process. The fact is that Indian Americans are disproportionately located in overwhelmingly Democratic-leaning states. And therefore, the marginal value of those votes, by definition, will be lower. There's no escaping that fact. If you want to make a difference to American presidential politics, you have to be a swing constituency in a swing state. You can't be a member of the majority-leaning party in what would be a state that is aligned with the interests of that majority. So that is a fact, right? You can't change that. But I think there are two things that both Neera and Amar said, which I think are very profound. We've got to think of involvement in politics beyond just elections. And so beyond national offices, you have to look really to local offices, because that's where, in many ways, what America is decided at the most intimate level. And that essentially means counties, literally at the sub-state levels. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. The second issue is something that Neera said in passing. We really ought not to think too much about this as Indian Americans, because I think if you use that as the peg on which to pivot your involvement in activism, then I think we will always fall short. We really have to think about this as Americans, because the question is really, what kind of a country do we want to build and leave behind? And that goes way beyond what the parochial interests of a particular demographic are, including a very successful demographic that we represent. And if you ask yourself what is important for the United States going forward, then I don't think you'll find any shortage of issues. And I don't think you'll find any reason not to be part of the process. And so I think that's the kind of emphasis that needs to be reaffirmed. I think sometimes the hyphenation actually gets in the way. And if one begins to think simply about the future of this country that we care about, I think you'll find plenty of opportunities.
So could I just make, I'll just add one, can you mind if I just add one point to this, which I would like to, I very much appreciate what Ashley said about swing voters, but I want to maybe add a little bit to that, which is that it's absolutely the case that you focus on, in a presidential race, you focus on particular states, but I think this election has proven that a kind of traditional approach to political science and swing voters is perhaps not how we should approach these things, and ensuring that you get base votes in the swing states is a critical element. But I think if we want to look past this election to future elections, in 2018, there will be governor's races in all of this, almost every state that has a large Indian American community. Florida, New Jersey and Virginia in 2017, but states throughout the country, we're going to have, I can't remember, dozens of governor's races. There will be states with communities, California, with large Indian American communities, and I think it's important for us to recognize, again, that community has a strong voice in those races that are upcoming, and obviously in House races and other races to come.
I think I'll add one more thing. There's this really interesting long-term impact, right, that comes from the role model effect. So as an example, the US spelling bee, who's been winning it for multiple years now, right? Kids of Indian American origin, right? In politics, we didn't have those kind of role models, right? Before Ami Bera, I think the previous person, Indian American in Congress, was back in the 50s, right? Dilip Kumar Sound and so on. Now we have... Well, Bobby Jindal as a governor, absolutely. But now we've got 5 folks in Congress. We've got, a cabinet member, Governor Haley. We've got the largest single department in the entire country of the U.S., run by an Indian, Seema Verma, which is the Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services.
They still have to get confirmed.
They have to still get elect or, designees. But I think this role model effect of all these folks being in these positions will have a dramatic impact on people in their 20s and 30s. I have 2 kids in their 20s, and I'm telling you this is having an impact on them, a very positive impact.
Yeah.
So could I actually just respond? And I think what maybe I'll add to something Ashley said earlier, and really made a very profound comment, which is that the Indian American community has been has succeeded in part because of a unique ingredient in the United States, which is ingredients that include tolerance of diversity, acceptance of immigrants, a commitment to opportunity for all. These are values that are fundamentally American, and I really couldn't say it better than Ashley. I was, as people know, I was very much engaged in the electoral process on one side of it. I don't want to relitigate that, but I will just say at the broadest levels that many of those values were called into question. I mean, I'm online. I've never actually experienced anti-Indian racism except in the last year. You know, people who were white nationalists targeted me for being Indian. So I think this is the incredible success of the Indian American community is a absolute tribute to the values that Ashley has described. But I think we are making a mistake if we believe there is no backlash in the United States to that success. And I think that's why it's more important than ever for Indian Americans. And I think we need to do this in every political party, to every political leader. We need to be clear that we are as American as anyone else, and that you cannot essentially want to fraternize with the Indian American community at the same time that you're flaming those voices. I mean, I was shocked to see, and I've been in politics for a long time. I've never experienced that in any point in any election that I've ever been part of. But the fact that people were targeting people based on their race and being Indian is a profound, and I think it is an amazing thing that Indian American kids are leading the spelling bee. But if you go online and you go on Twitter when that's happening, you see the backlash to that success. And I think that in a moment like this, it's more important for Indian Americans to engage in the political process, to stand up, to not just live in their success, but allow and ensure that that success is available to future generation of American immigrants. And that unfortunately, and I hate to say this, I think that is in question.
Yes.
I'll take it as a follow-up to what Ashley said earlier, which is, just as a counterpoint to what you're saying, if you're saying you should consider yourself American first, not really worry about hyphenation, how do you address the civil rights issues? You have folks like, Mr. Patel in Alabama. Had that happened to an African American, things would be different, and that's because African Americans coalesce together. And that's what I'm really referring to when I say the AAPI vote. Typically, votes are looked at not just state by state, but also ethnicities. Is it the AAPI, targeting certain communities? Previous elections, the African American vote was kind of a key base vote. So that's going to continue changing as the demographic of the country changes. So, frankly, and respectfully, I kind of disagree with you in that sense, that shouldn't this be more about figuring out whether you're relevant or not, and if you are, how you're relevant, and how you're addressing those issues specifically now, given what's happening at the national level, and as MR mentioned, at the local level, it's, we're seeing a lot more engagement.
I don't think we necessarily have a disagreement. What I'm concerned about is that we don't get into the trap of trying to rectify problems that affect just us. I think we need to hold the country we live in to the mirror of what the country was meant to be. And there's a way to make the argument that in America not being what it's called to be, not being the best, it diminishes itself. And to the degree that it treats some communities in ways that they ought not to be treated, it somehow weakens the body politic as a whole. And I find that a lot more persuasive than going out there and making and engaging in special pleading for Indian Americans or anyone else. I'm not opposed to doing that, and on occasion you will have to do it. And when there are specific violations, obviously you have to address the specific violations in their entirety. But as a general rule, I think the issue is not that Indian Americans are treated in ways that are unfair or African Americans are treated in ways that are unfair. I think the solution is really to go back to the genius of the civil rights movement. And I think Martin Luther King's great insight was that if America does not realize the need to redeem its constitutional pledges to itself and to all its citizens, then America becomes less than what it is. And yes, there will be some citizens groups, Black Americans at that time, who bore a special brunt because of that failure to redeem those promises. But I think the real challenge is to hold all Americans up to the standards that are laid out in the Constitution. And if we can get American politics as a whole to do that, then I think whatever special problems Indian Americans face will take care of themselves.
Neera, counter? You have something to say.
I don't have a counter. I mean, my short answer is anybody who's focused on our leaders adhering to the Constitution these days is someone I agree with. But I think I would agree absolutely with Ashley that particularly for the Indian American community, I think we should recognize our place as part of the fabric of the country, and that is a critical goal. I think it's an odd moment I think we should think about the context of the moment we're in, and my worry, which I hope is an unjustified worry, is that as we see ourselves as less Indian and more, or less Indian American and more just American, that there's an element of society that is seeing us more as Indian and less as American. And I think and they are not doing that because we're seeing ourselves as Indian American. They're doing that in part because of the success of the community. And so I absolutely think that we should uphold the basic values of the society, and that should be the basis by which we judge. But I worry that we'll be two ships crossing in the night to the adverse of the Indian American community as we do so.
Sorry, you had one thing and then.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is Hasini from Vivox TV.
To connect the understanding of civil rights and why whether you are brown or you're black, or you speak different languages, or you have a funny accent, or you don't speak English, why that matters is it was only in 1965, when the Civil Rights Act was passed and the Voting Rights Act was passed, that the formal legalization of the current immigration process that allowed Indian Americans under a quota system to come here came into being. That is only 1965. So if we were thinking about 60 years, we are thinking 50 years ago that it was possible for Sunil Wadhwani to leave IIT, or for me to leave IIT or wherever and come here, study, actually get a green card and live in this country. So when rights are gained with great difficulty on the backs of people who had to fight for them, whether they were Martin Luther King or Dilip Singh Sond, do not ever take them for granted. That's what we're celebrating
Thank